This is Gemara Nazir Daf Yod, and we pick it up from the top of Yod Amud Aleph at the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Omar, if someone says, and the statement that he says might sound slightly interesting, which of course will be the topic of discussion of today's daf. If someone says, Amra Para Zu, this cow says, Hareini Nazir, Nizira, this cow said, I am a Nazir, im oimedes, if I stand up. So there's a dual Nikuda, a tool detail that is interesting over here. Number one, we have cows talking. And number two, not only is the cow talking, we have cows standing up. So the cow is saying, I am a Nazir if I stand up. Or, continues the Mishnah, Imay Medisani. Oimer Adelis, a door says, Azari Nizirim Niftach. The door says, I'm a Nazir if I open up. Im Niftachani, Beishami Abrim Nazir, Beisalam Einay Nazir. So similar to the discussion we had in the previous Mishnah. And as we're going to see in today's daf, this is really not just similar, really almost a first cousin, perhaps a brother and sister, a complementary din of the previous Mishnah. Beis Shammai says he is a Nazir. Beis Hillel says no. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Av Kishamru Beis Shammai, and this is the same Rabbi Yehuda from yesterday. Even though Beis Shammai seemingly says he's a Nazir, Lo Yoimrim Ella, Ba'omer Harei Parazu Alai Karban, is only in a case in which he says, this cow is to me like a carbon, im oimedesi, if she stands up. So it's not that he's accepting upon himself Nazirus, but rather he's accepting upon himself to bring a carbon of this cow if it stands up. That's the Mishnah, an interesting Mishnah. Machlekes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, an addition of Rabbi Yehuda. Says the Gemara, question number one, perhaps the most obvious question on the Mishnah. Para Mika Mishtai. What in the world is going on over here? Why do we have talking cows? What does it mean that the cow spoke? Amar Rabbi Bar Chama answers, Amar Chama Chama Eskinan. Says Rabbi Bar Chama, you know what the case is, that we have a cow lying on the ground. Va'amar. And a person says to himself, Kisvura parazu. A person says, this cow thinks that what? Someone is speaking out the thought of the cow. This cow in front of me that's lying down thinks it can't get up. And the person articulates, Hareini Nazir mi bisara im amda me'ela. I'm a Nazir from its flesh if it gets up on its own. And what indeed happens? Va'amda me'ela. And it goes and it gets up on its own. So it's not a case that the cow itself is actually talking, but rather the cow is lying there in front of him, and the person says to himself, you know what this cow is thinking? I really wish I could get up, and I would become a Nazir if I could get up. Meaning like a way to push himself to get up. So of course the cow can't be a Nazir, but the person means that he himself will be a Nazir from the cow's meat. So there's again two details of interesting. One is that it's dependent upon the cow. Two is that he's saying mi bisara. And so then says the Gemara, that is the case. Now that we understand the case, it's not the case of the talking cow, it's the case of the cow lying there, and he's articulating what the cow would think, that if it could get up, I'll become a Nazir. Now we have the Machlekes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel from yesterday. Beis Shammai Da'amri, Beis Shammai who previously said that someone makes himself a neder from dates and dried figs, which are entities that have no shaykhs to the zira, have a Nazir, just like in that case Beis Shammai said they are a Nazir. Hachanami Kamar Visara have a Nazir. So too in this case, says Beis Shammai, he's a Nazir as well. Beis Hillel Aimrim lo have a Nazir. Beis Hillel says no. Just like in the case of the dried figs and the dates, there was no Naziros, so too over there. So the Gemara is explaining that the Mishnah is not involving talking cows. It just means the cow is lying in front of him, and it's the same old machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel from the previous Mishnah. Now, we've had such a good explanation. The Gemara says, 20 lines down, the first word line is Vaha. It's beautiful what you're telling me, and I understand the Pshat so well. Asks the Gemara, Beis Shammai already said this. Why does Beis Shammai have to say it again? So Amar Rava says, Rava Tarti Utalas. Says Rava, 2 or even 3 examples are being stated of the same din of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, and they're all necessary. And all 3 cases are necessary. Explains to the Gemara, what exactly does this mean? If it would have only said the case of the Gregorius and the Vela, the previous Mishnah, I would have thought, over there says they're Nazir. Why? Because people could mistaken dates and dried figs for grapes, and I'm sure many people, the first time they read the previous Mishnah, mistakenly thought Gregorius, the Vela, Tzemukin, Garninim, whatever it is, it's a form of grape. So people can make such a mistake. But to confuse meat for grapes, no one would ever do that. So that's why I had to say the first 2 cases. And if it would have just said case number 2, our case of the meat, I would have thought, I would have thought, you know why Beis Shammai says in this case you're a Nazir? Because meat and wine, 2 peas in a pod, they're entities, they go together, PB and jelly. So meat and wine go together. So he said meat, but it goes with wine. It makes sense that he's a Nazir. But in the case of the Gregorius and the Vela, I would have thought that in that case, maybe Beis Shammai holds you're not a Nazir. Kamash on the first 2 cases. Would have just said these 2 cases. In these cases, Beis Shammai says his din. Maybe you'd agree to Beis Hillel that what? That he is not a Nazir. And finally, Vitana Delas, and if it would have just said the 3rd case, I would have thought, this case is so odd. The door. So that's what Beis Hillel says you're not a Nazir. The first 2 cases of Gregorius and the case of the Basar, Beis Shammai, Kamash, Malan, and Delai. And that's why we need 3 cases all hovering over the same detail of Beis Shammai telling us that they're similar enough to create a Nazirus, and Beis Hillel saying the opposite. So we have a Mishnah. What was the case of the Mishnah? It wasn't talking cows. What did Rabbi Bar Chama teach us? Rabbi Bar Chama teaches us is the case is there's a cow lying in front of him, and he says that if the cow stands up, then I'm going to be a Nazir. So asks the Gemara 5 lines on the bottom of Yudam and Aleph, Amar Rava, Mika Tani im Amda Be'elah. The Mishnah doesn't say those words. The Mishnah just says that the Parazu im Aimedes. It doesn't say im Amda Be'elah, and the detail according to Rabbi Bar Chama is specifically the cow thinking, I wish I could get up on its own. And in that case, if it does, it's going to be a Nazir according to Beis Shammai and not according to Beis Hillel. But asks Rava, the Mishnah never honed in on such a detail of standing up on its own. Ella Amar Rava, so Rava argues on Rabbi Bar Chama, and Rava gives a new way of learning the Mishnah. Says Rava, you know what the case is? The cow is lying in front of him. And again, the person says, Karban, and the person says, it is incumbent upon me to bring the Karban of a Nazir if the cow gets up. So Rava is going similarly, that the person is talking out what the cow thinks, and therefore that's why he's implying a Nazirus. But according to Rava, it's not a Nikuda specifically. If the cow gets up on its own, rather it's that the cow doesn't think it's going to get up at all. And now the cow is saying, and the person is articulating, if I get up. And that fits better with the words of the Mishnah of Aimedes, and it's not a detail of Aimedes Me'elel. Says the Gemara 3 lines from the bottom, asking Rav Bishlam para bas karbani. Okay, so the case of karban, of para, I understand that a para can be brought, a cow could be a karban. Eladelis bas karbani. How you can explain the case of the Mishnah of Adelis of the door? The door is not can't be a karban. Ela marava kain para ruvutz lefanav. Says Rava. Okay, new case. We have a cow lying in front of him. As we turn over to Yeramid Beis, and what does he say? Arini Nazir miyayin imloy amda. I'm making myself a Nazir from wine. If what? If the cow does not get up, and lo and behold, what happens? Much to his surprise, we should say. And what happens? V'amda. And lo and behold, the cow gets. And lo and behold, excuse me, 1 second. Lo and behold, Ve'amda, there it is, ve'amda me'eleha. And now the cow gets up on his own. So again, Rav is explaining, it's a cow lying in front of him, but he articulates miyayin. So, and then the cow gets up on its own. So Beishami Savri. So now we go a little bit deeper. What exactly are Beishami Beisil disagreeing of this case of the cow lying in front of him? And he says, I'm becoming a Nazir if what? If the cow does not stand up. Says Beishami Turfei. And the Rosh over here explains what's turfei from the wordage of the tairif of the shtar, the main part. So we're now digging into his psyche, says Beishami. Turfei daigavra. You know what the main detail of this guy's mind, you know what he means to say? Misham ukmei biyadei. The reason is because the cow he wants to bring up with his own hands too. And he didn't bring it up with his own hands. And therefore, says Beishame, because he didn't bring up the cow with his own hands, that is the reason why Beisil holds that he becomes a Nazir. He said, I'm a Nazir if I don't pick this up with my own hands. He didn't pick it up with his own hands, the cow, and therefore he's a Nazir. Beisil al-Savri, Beisil disagrees, 4 lines on the top of Yunam and Beis. Mishum de Ravio. Says Beisil, no. The detail is that the cow is lying down. And he's saying, I'm a Nazir if what? If the cow remains lying down. V'akant, and the cow did not remain lying down. And therefore says Beisil, he is not a Nazir. So according to this explanation, we have many new details. He's articulating explicitly Nazir miyayin. And now we're going and we're explaining that what's the machlokes, how deep into his mindset does he mean only if I pick it up with his own hands, says Beishamai. And he didn't do that, so he's a Nazir. Or no, does he mean if it lies on the ground and it's not lying there anymore and therefore he's not a Nazir, says Beis Hillel. Asks the Gemara 5 lines down, let's look at the end of the Mishnah. Amar Rav Yehuda, Av kishamru Beishamai lo amru ella. When did Beishamai say is din ela by merihina like carbon? Only if he said that this entity should be a carbon. The problem is, what did Rava say in the top line of this Amud? He says explicitly Nazir miyayin. So now that Rava is articulating so beautifully what the case is, Rav Yehuda in the Mishnah makes no sense. Para mika matvis midi. What does this have anything to do with the cow? Meaning, if you learn that the first part of the Mishnah is more ambiguous, he just said he's a Nazir, then Rav Yehuda could come along and he could explain it's a he's referring to the carbon, that the cow should be a carbon. But now that we're explaining that Rav is learning that he said explicitly Nazir miyayin, so how could Rav Yehuda make any sense in the Mishnah? Ella kegayin, we're about 10 lines down. The first line is matvis. Says the Gemara, okay, let's one more time reinterpret what's going on in the Mishnah. Ella kegayin, you know what he said? Ta'amar areini nazir mi besara. The person says, I'm a Nazir from the flesh, from the meat of the cow. Im loy amda. If it does not stand up, again, not imedes, not amda ani, but rather im loy amda, and then va'amda me'aleha, it stood up on its own. And now here is the machlokes Beishami Beisil, like we said a moment ago. Beishami savitar v'dahu kavri. Note the main detail is mishum okma biyadei. He's a Nazir unless he picks up the cow with his own hands. Who? He didn't do that, and therefore he's going to be a Nazir. I'm a Nazir unless it says he's lying in the ground. It's not on the ground, and therefore he's not a Nazir. Says the Gemara, 1 second. 6 lines from the bottom. Based on the explanation that we just said, it comes out that what's Beisil saying? If it gets up, Eloi Kamt have a Nazir. Beisil says he's not a Nazir if it gets up. If it doesn't get up, if the cow continues lying in the ground, he is a Nazir. V'amri b'misara la a Nazir. How could I mean? But Beisil says that if someone says, I'm a Nazir from the meat, V'hamri mi bisara, but Beis Hillel are of the opinion that when someone says mi bisara, not saying a Nazir straight, but a Nazir from an entity which can't really be a Nazir, from flesh, from meat of a cow, lo yav a Nazir. As we explained in Amud Aleph, Beis Hillel holds if someone says I'm a Nazir from Groigros, there's no Nazirus, because there's no Nazirus on Groigros. So too over here, if he says he's a Nazir from Bisara, there can't be any Nazirus. So we're now explaining that the reason why there's no Nazirus is because the cow gets up. But according to Beis Hillel, it's irrelevant if the cow gets up. There should never be a Nazir because he says mi basara. Answers the Gemara classically, L'taimayu de Beis Shammai kamri, Ledi don, according to us, if you look, Kamte nami lavi Nazir. Us, Beis Hillel, if he doesn't get up, he's not a Nazir. But L'didchu, you Beis Shammai, Damri, to have a Nazir, you hold it to Nazir. Oidel on Mios, you should at least admit to us that Turva then Gavr Mishum de Raviyah. At least admit to us that the main details that he wants, if the cow is lying down. V'akamt, and the cow got up, so Beis Hillel is asking Beis Shammai, why are you saying it's a Nazir if the cow got up? It got up, he just didn't want it lying down. Beis Shammai responds, Larav Turva de Gavr Mishum Ukma biyadihu v'halei Ukma. Says Beis Shammai, no, that's not the main detail of this man. You know what the main detail of this guy is? That he wants to pick it up with his own hands. And he didn't pick it up with his own hands, and that's the reason why he will, yes, be a Nazir according to Beis Shammai. So fascinating machlokes Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel at the end of the day, arguing about a case with a cow lying in front of him. And he says if the cow doesn't get up, he'll be a Nazir according to Beis Shammai. He is a Nazir because he didn't pick up the cow according to Beis Hillel. He is not a Nazir because Lamaisa, the cow is not lying down. Beis Hillel, regardless, well, it's not a Nazir because he says mi basara. No, Beis Hillel is responding according to Beis Shammai. We'll pick it up on Daf Yomi in the next year. B'siyata Dishmaya.